Okay, thank you for the opportunity to present this work, and thank you all for coming. First, I would like to begin by a word about the publication that is on display actually in the exhibition. Just to say that it's a compilation, it's a contributed volume, it's a compilation of a collection of essays, research work, some artist interventions, a photographic essay, mappings. So it's a very diverse set of contributions that we've put together, and it's edited by Muna Fawaz, myself, Muna Harib, and Dunya Salami, who's with us today. Yes, I won't talk a lot about the publication per se. I want to focus more on the original research mapping projects that we produced in this publication that I will take you through. And one last note on credits, all of the visualizations that you're going to see today are co-authored with Monica Basbous and myself. I will begin by some theoretical framing and then move to talk more specifically about the mapping work. In the 1998 essay, Human Cartography, When It Is Good to Map, Danny Dorling responds to the re-questioning of conventional maps and map making, one that emerged in various forms in the previous 50 years, and is still very much in negotiation today, by directing our attention to maps of a different kind. So, of the multiple ways that cartography has been persistently challenged, we can note many things, including Guy Debord, the psychogeography exercise, and the situationists of the 50s and 60s and their experiential strategies of experiencing cities, the emergence of human cartography in the 80s, arguing for a stronger focus on people's lives, J.B. Harley's deconstructivist approach to the history of cartography and its authoritative power, Dennis Wood's iconoclastic mapmaking, and of course, Michel de Certeau's description of the totalizing eye as a critique of the planner's longing for order and organization. And more recently, and more interestingly, calls for feminist data visualization, of which we can note the great work of Catherine D'Ignazio, as well as the emergence of narrative, vernacular, participatory, whatever you want to call it. I think these terms are still we're negotiating the definitions today. So these kinds of narrative, vernacular, participatory mappings are being increasingly used by social researchers, academics, artists, and designers alike. We should also not overlook the continuous evolution of new mapping technologies, and more importantly, the attempts to open access to such mapping technologies and give rise to alternative sources of spatial knowledge and an even more and ever more present citizen cartography. Of course, here I'm talking about platforms like OpenStreetMap, which is user-fed, and other free and open source mapping software and digital tools. Much of this critique, past and present, is based on framing quantitative geography as unsympathetic, obsessed with accuracy, and fostering statistical social landscapes. In that sense, the move away from classical cartography can be broadly seen as a shift from the quantitative to the qualitative. Even though fact-filled maps can be sinister or blindly conventional at best, Dorling points out that the question, when is it good to map, should not only be answered by examining, quote, the extent to which researchers who analyze numbers about people ignore other ways of studying society, end quote. By acknowledging that even data-driven maps can do numbers differently, Dorling encourages us to not to merely be critical of conventional maps, but to produce new kinds of maps that are themselves critical, operating outside the dominant concerns of spatial accuracy and objectivity. It is within this interest in re-questioning the mapping convention and among such critical reflections on cartography that we position the data visualization work presented here. Through a number of mapping exercises focused on different aspects of refugee practices in Beirut, this visual research develops a series of readings that document and spatially represent the refugee experience as generative and multifaceted. This aim is in response to two things. The first is popular media, gray reports, and academic research that typically construct a very homogeneous narrative of forced displacement when it comes to refugees, depicting them as a group of destitute, powerless, and passive recipients of aid and relief efforts. It is equally our work in response to the dominant discourse deployed by political leaders and mainstream media, where refugee talk often favors the vocabulary of security, fear, risk, and the existential threats posed by cross-border mobility. In both cases, the talk is alarming, clearly privileging a language of crisis. But contrary to these representations, our observations in Lebanon over the past years have revealed an impressive competence among Syrian refugees to learn and negotiate the city and effectively participate in its making. It is important to point out that the mappability of things is at the heart of the running critical debate in cartography and practice. We should not be surprised that maps usually favor the empirical, observable, and quantifiable data. After all, they have often, if not always, been an instrument of power, presented as scientific, objective evidence of the subjects they render visible or invisible, and have had little room or regard for uncertainty. However, to admit that a map is a selective account of the complexity of the world becomes a starting point for questioning not only how a map is produced, so its material conditions, its authors, subjects, methods, but equally what, or more precisely, who a map can map, and how the map itself can encapsulate these questions and render them visible. This inevitably raises the question of what and who is mappable at all, often the visible, the countable, the material, and gives any answer to that question an inherently political dimension. It also implies another question: what or who is not being mapped and why? This becomes particularly pertinent when confronted with the prospect of mapping refugees in the city, a category of people that in the recent context of Lebanon is elusive, precariously present, and systemically and systematically rendered invisible. As mentioned previously, the different components of the research together aim at countering a depoliticized refugee narrative and disrupting the dominant understandings of refugees as mere victims of violence of wars or the angst of host communities. But the work further aims at unbundling the visual representation of the refugee category, moving beyond census cartography, which you see here, exemplified perfectly by the undifferentiated cluster representations of refugees by humanitarian agencies, such as UNHCR, and towards more practice-based, bottom-up articulations with a focus on people's navigations of their daily lives, and through which refugees are recognized as active social agents. These are recent image grabs of the UNHCR Syria page. And as you can see on the right, the type of demographic representations that exist for refugees cartographically speaking. So as we zoom in into Lebanon, this cluster really remains very undifferentiated. And it's interesting that the UNHCR refers to refugees in Lebanon as persons of interest. So it's a very sort of homogeneous, broad category within which all of these experiences are being lumped and represented in such a way. So it is our interest to counter these kinds of representations. By putting refugee practice and lived experience at the center, we develop and adopt design and visualization strategies that allow for their knowledge, as well as that of the authors, to directly inform the language and method of their representation. At the outset of the data collection for the 3 research projects presented here, focusing on 3 themes: labor, dwelling, and navigation, things did indeed seem unmappable for us at first, but not for so long. The first research, Syrian-owned businesses in the city, is supported by diagrammatic visualizations of findings based on qualitative, semi-structured, in-depth interviews with 12 self-employed Syrian entrepreneurs operating businesses after 2011, mainly in the Hamra neighborhood, which is a major commercial district in West Beirut. We were initially hoping to collect data with clear geographical dimensions and variables, so locations of shops, networks across the country, operational trajectories, and so on. And the small size of our sample, we're talking about 12 people here, about 12 cases, was particularly attractive for an exploration of traceable information. Just a little note here, I mean, we talk about big data all the time, and it's interesting. I think a shift that we're trying to present is a kind of a focus on small data and the value in that. But there were pressing concerns here for anonymity, which quickly prompted us to formulate a new mapping direction. It became imperative to depart from the political vulnerability of the mapping subject and to accept it as a driver of the information that could be collected and that could be visualized. New methods had to emerge from the raw data at hand, which were really just interviews. And starting from this qualitative speech-based data, we sought to identify recurring themes and concerns in order to allow for measurable, quantifiable, if you wish, measures to come forth. So this is an initial reading that was produced by juxtaposing particular set of qualitative variables. So the mention of depth, ideas about future plans, these entrepreneurs or business owners' relationships to the neighborhood, etc. And we generated in this way a more quantifiable measure of success. However, with success being a deeply subjective notion, these visualizations are perhaps more pertinent if read as indicators of difference, deconstructing the monolithic accounts of Syrian refugees as put forth by dominant discourse. So the way that, quickly the way that they work is that you have 0 in the center, and the more you move outwards on each axis, the more the measure of success is actually amplified. So basically, the bigger the surface area, the bigger the success. And through these kinds of visualizations, we were able to create categories of, the struggling, from the struggling to the successful across the range of sample that we had. This is a diagram where we see all of these overlapped on top of each other. So again, it's a way for us to begin to visualize moments where the density of the color becomes an indication for a recurrence or more of a generalization, if you wish, as far as the concerns are concerned. We can point out a lot of findings from these, but I have a lot to go through, so if you let me, I'll just continue. In the second reading of this same data, speech analysis allowed us to interpret certain occurrences in the interviews as indicators of particular challenges and concerns the business owners are facing. So we sort of summed up these interviews by extracting particular concerns that they have, and we rated them by mention. You can see them broken down by each of the participants in this diagram. But we were also very aware of the fact that these are not mutually exclusive, independent notions. So we tried to create also a diagrammatic representation of how this lexicon works in an integrated way, where there's overlaps and relationships between the different concerns. This might be a bit more clearer when I talk about the rest of the visualizations within this project. What we did is take these concerns that you saw before and then break them down into sub-themes, and then within these diagrams provide quotes from the interviews that elucidate, if you wish, or clarify the way in which we used them as an interpretive measure to come up with these categories and come up with these concerns. This is an example where you see some of the quotes that we extracted. Just to give you an example, when we talk about my Lebanese in-laws offered me a car, we're clearly talking about mobility, but at the same time we're talking about networks to Lebanese, right? So these are two of the sub-themes, for example, that we had. Sometimes we were forced to kind of place one thing in a certain category rather than the other, but this is why we created the lexicon that you saw earlier on, just to clarify these interrelationships that exist across these thematics. So by abstracting the data through categorization and quantification, we were able to identify overarching concerns, their extent and their intersections. By delving back into the complexity of the transcribed interviews, we were able to further deconstruct these concerns and substantiate them. And by using quotes from the interviews within the diagrams, we provide insight into how interpretation was carried out and expose the inner workings of the mapping method. The second project, Inhabiting the City, Remaking Its Quarters, looks to understand the settlement of young middle-income refugees in Jetawi, a Christian neighborhood located in the eastern edge of Beirut. I'll try to be quick. Right. So this was based on interviews with 8 young Syrian men living in the area, where we asked questions about patterns of mobility and perceptions and negotiations of spaces in the city. So the field research in this case was more geographic by nature when we started. So we took information, again, based on interviews with these research participants. We highlighted spatial information about the city that they mentioned, so particularly the landmarks that they know in different areas and the neighborhoods that they are familiar with. While the landmarks and streets, which you see represented here as dots and lines, were very straightforward to pinpoint, sectors, neighborhoods, so basically bigger areas were very difficult to identify through, at least through these accounts. So we had to, in this case, rely on an official representation of the sectors of the city. And you see basically these sort of different textures which represent these sectors that are mentioned by the research participants that get basically denser the more that they are mentioned. Similarly to how also the landmarks and the streets get denser or thicker when they're mentioned more. We on purpose decided to keep them somehow boundaryless because we were uncomfortable with this idea of the imposed neighborhood. And this question of what actually delineates a neighborhood becomes a very important question for us in this research, something that we will attend to more particularly in the coming research project. Some of the findings here that were interesting for us is, for example, the similarity of the amount of knowledge that exists in the area over here, which is Hamra, and the area in the east, which is Jaitawi. But delving through the interviews, we also realized that even though they know these areas in a similar way, their perceptions of them were very different. So going back to the theoretical framework, even though this map is in fact accurate, it is misleading. And in order for us to kind of represent the experience of these research participants more accurately, we introduced in the legend of the map a kind of a matrix of these different mentioned neighborhoods where we rate their positive and negative attributes based on speech that we excavate from the interviews as well. I'm not gonna point them out now. You can find them later. They're in the exhibition, but you can find Hamra and Jaitawi, for example, having a similar number of mentions, but clearly the positive negative rating is shifted amongst them. So the third project, Seeing the City as a Delivery Driver, investigates the strategies of learning and navigating the city among 23 delivery men currently residing in Beirut. So we're talking about basically men on scooters that deliver food from restaurants to offices and residential apartments. It becomes an entry point for us to research the urbanization of the refugee experience. By this point, we were keen on continuing with the method of collecting data on spatial knowledge from the beginning, and the uniformity of the third group as working delivery men and the pertinence this vocational disposition has to learning and practicing the city allowed for a relative data stability, which with less variables and more opportunities for in-depth spatial readings. But the detailed and disparate understandings of the city by the delivery drivers presented a new set of challenges as well as opportunities. I will explain a little bit how this kind of mapping took place. So what we asked these delivery men is for a list of the landmark of the neighborhoods that they know in Beirut, so really a kind of a log, and to put within each neighborhood the familiar landmarks that they know within it. These are the landmarks of one of the delivery men who mentioned Hamra, one of the 17 delivery men who mentioned Hamra neighborhood. There were these landmarks in this street. So basically what we did is a very simple sort of delineation, outlining, grouping of these elements, and for us, this is really what constituted the definition of the neighborhood, and we did not want to rely on the arbitrariness of the lines, the polygons of the official maps. Of course, we have instances such as this, where something like the American University of Beirut, up there where we work, does not get only a sort of a point relationship to the boundary, but we do consider the expanse of the campus. So in a way, the interpretation happened as a negotiation between the information given to us by the deliverymen, but also our own knowledge of the city and our own understanding of the elements of the city. So these would be the 17, in fact, that were given to us by the different drivers. And then what we do is join them all together in one diagram that then becomes what we call the collective account of Hamra by these deliverymen. And as we join it with other accounts of the city, it actually becomes increasingly detailed and complex. Can I get a couple more minutes? 2 more. Okay, I will leave this work till later. I mean, you can see it in the exhibition. These are the data sets that are on display. And lastly, I just want to point out that there are further potential inventories that could be taken out of this research. So what we have over here is ways that we realize that people understand the city. So you can see neighborhood morphologies as chains or puzzles. You can see a relationship between different neighborhoods as having shared edges or ruptures. And you can see relationships between neighborhoods and streets that are formed either on edges, axiality, exclusion, and other forms of spatial understanding. We hope that this body of work, primarily what it does is that it shifts the attention or the narrative of refugees from enduring their realities to effectively making them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ahmad. Someone, yes, question.
Thanks, Ahmad. It was absolutely fascinating. I particularly appreciate the last patterns that they actually show, like trying to, in a way, conceptualize what is really happening in the city. I have a question concerning your title. Well, the selection, so refugees as city makers. I saw mostly refugees as interpreters of the city in a way. So I just wonder if you can elaborate a little bit more on the idea of making something. And at the same time, I wonder if, like, the selection of the categories specifically, to what extent people were comfortable with that. So the idea of being identified as refugees instead of, people that normally live their lives inside a context that is much more complex and hybrid as you have described, actually.
Sorry, the first question was about?
It was about the refugees as makers.
Yeah, the makers. So I think that we need to interpret this idea of city making differently with each of the research projects. The effect that the business owners had on the Hamra neighborhood was actually pretty visible. So by including a new set of retail services that exist in the city, a new kind of clientele that's attracted towards that, there's a very simple, clear way in which there is city making happening in that process. I think the second research project is slightly different in the sense that city making is interpreted more, if you wish, in a classical way that pushes migrant communities to cluster in cities. In that sense, so it's the idea of the creation of home when it comes to a particular neighborhood. So this is the second I think, finding. And the third one becomes actually more complex, and it's about these delivery drivers given the opportunity to roam the streets very freely, while refugees actually don't really or at least under sort of common understandings of restriction and, and their limited space in the city, we find that there is a kind of a liberating practice there. There's a sense of pride that these men have in learning how to negotiate different legal obstacles when it comes to mobility in the city. And ultimately, we see it basically as the presence, as their body being present in public space as a kind of a critical practice of emancipation. So in that sense, we find that there's a huge contribution actually to the concept of city making, which can be, admittedly a slightly vague concept. Now, regarding your second question, which is a very interesting question, it was a running debate among our team. So let me begin by telling you that none of the people that we interviewed in the 3 research projects, whether they're delivery drivers, business owners, or middle-class young men living in Jetawi, none of them identified as refugees. None of them used the term refugees. And of course, we are very much in favor of referring to individuals and communities by the appellation that they prefer. But it's also important to note here that the government in Lebanon also tries to avoid the category of refugees because it implicates them in terms of legal responsibility. And they try to continue to identify these people as displaced, to keep them in a kind of a situation of transience. So it was a very difficult choice for us to take, but we ultimately decided to use the term refugees as a kind of a political statement that counters this sort of tactical way that the government is approaching the subject.
Question. I have a question for you, Ahmad. I was wondering, actually I was thinking back about the two presentations yesterday, Gloria's and Tiffen, where we talked about, in Gloria, I remember this part where she talked about making the map, trying to find the right data for the map. So you're trying to map things that you really want to be saying as if you have an a priori of what the map should talk about. And then with Tiffen, we talked about categories as something that can explain what you're looking at, but also that makes you kind of run the chance of missing out on the particularities. So it explains, but then it also flattens. And those are 2 things that you brought within your presentation. And I was wondering, in terms of making these maps, what's the sequence or what's the relation between your colleagues who are on the field and you as the map maker, and who has the right data and who is allowed to interpret the data and where does it stop, or like how does that work, the collaboration?
Redefining aspect of our methodology of work, actually, which is this sort of dialectic relationship that exists between research and representation. A couple of days ago, Dunya and I gave a talk specifically about that in ENRS. So I will sum up briefly the kind of, chronologically if you wish, but like briefly, what happened here. So with the first research project, for example, as I said, we wanted to, all of us as a team understand these kind of spatial relationships that might exist in the city. But as soon as the data got collected and so the researchers would go and bring it back to us, it was very clear that we couldn't do that anymore. Then it becomes a team effort in order to decide what then can be mappable and what are the points that we want to raise through these representations. The interpretation of the speech analysis, for example, happens primarily by the mappers, but then it's run by the researchers in order for verification, because they were the people who were dealing with these individuals. So if we interpreted something a certain way, sometimes there's a tone of voice that's missing from the piece of paper that is brought back to us so that we can further have insight into what this actually means. Often also the visualization work changes the premise of the research project to begin with. So there's a lot of back and forth. We usually get the data, we map. Based on the mapping, we have further questions to ask, such as in the second research project. We saw a similar sort of representation of these two east and west neighborhoods, but we knew that the perceptions were not the same. So we had to go back to the data or go back to the field in order to supplement the map again with information. So there's a lot of kind of back and forth between these two things. The third one worked in a very similar way. Actually, in the third one, the mappers were a little bit more forceful. So we were like, from the beginning, okay, we want a log of neighborhoods and landmarks so that we can begin our work with geographical data that we can represent.
Let's piggyback on yours, actually. Yeah, so inevitably, did this work actually go back to your original participants? Did they give you feedback in terms of interpretation directly? Okay, I was just curious.
Short answer.
Thank you very much, Ahmad. Thank you for your presentation.